Okay, so we're diving into the Chad Daybell trial today. Um, you've been following it pretty closely, right? You sent me all these articles.
Oh, yeah, I have been. It's hard not to, honestly. Just the headlines alone are enough to make your jaw drop.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Multiple murders and mysterious deaths, and then you add in that whole doomsday prepper element. It's like something out of a movie, right?
Exactly. It's the kind of story that just grabs you and doesn't let go. And the testimonies we're going to be looking at today are just wild.
Oh, absolutely. We're
Yeah.
talking family members, friends, neighbors, even colleagues, people who knew Chad and Lori personally. And their accounts really start to poke holes in that whole narrative Chad's been trying to spin.
It's fascinating how these testimonies, especially from those closest to him, paint a very different picture of Chad Daybell. Almost like watching a puzzle being put together, but the pieces reveal a much darker image than we might have initially thought.
Right, exactly. Like, take the FBI analyst, Nick Belize, for instance. He presented all this digital evidence, phone pings, text messages, that sort of thing, and it really throws a wrench into Chad's claim that he had no idea what happened to those children.
It's the precision of these digital breadcrumbs that I find really striking. Remember, Chad's been saying he didn't know where the children were, but on September 9th, the day after Tylee was last seen, we have Belisa's testimony placing Chad at home, texting back and forth with Lori.
And then it gets even more interesting. The analyst was able to track these phone calls between Chad, Lori, and her brother Alex.
Yeah.
And guess what? Alex's phone pings put him right near where Tylee's remains were eventually found.
So it's like their phones are telling the story. And we see a similar pattern on September 23rd, the day JJ is believed to have been buried. More texts between Chad and Lori, and then boom, Alex's phone is pinging right at the spot where JJ was discovered.
It's hard to ignore that kind of evidence. I mean, what are the chances? The defense tried to suggest that maybe the FBI was framing Chad, but come on, that seems like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it?
It does, especially when you consider the sheer volume of digital evidence that was presented. And remember, this was all happening while Chad was at home. It's not like he was miles away, completely unaware of what was going on.
Okay, so we have this digital trail pointing right at Chad, but then you also have these conflicting stories that he was telling people about Tammy's death. Even his own family members started noticing inconsistencies in his accounts.
Right. It's like that old saying, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So you have Tammy Daybell's cousin, Patty, and Tammy's daughter, Hannah, both testifying that Chad gave them different versions of what happened.
Yeah, and one detail that really stuck out to me was Hannah's recollection of her dad going up and down stairs in the house.
Hmm.
But then Chad's attorney insisted that the house was only one story,
Mm.
which doesn't exactly add up, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it turns out there actually is an addition to the house with stairs leading to a loft. It's almost like the defense was trying to downplay the existence of those stairs.
It makes you think, if Chad's story is so straightforward, why not just acknowledge the stairs? What else is he trying to hide?
Exactly. And then you have Patty testifying that at Tammy's funeral, Chad was making these really insensitive remarks, even calling Tammy lazy and depressed. Not exactly the kind of loving tribute you'd expect from a grieving husband, is it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if he was already emotionally checked out of that marriage.
It's strange, isn't it? Almost like he was already distancing himself from Tammy, even in death. And that's even before we get into his suspiciously quick move out of the house. He was talking about moving to Rexburg with a friend less than a week after Tammy died.
Yeah, not exactly subtle. It all starts to seem a little less like a grieving husband and a little more like someone with something to hide. And then we have the testimony of Dr. Christensen, the former chief medical examiner in Utah. He actually conducted Tammy's autopsy back in 2020.
This is where things really start to change because Dr. Christensen determined that Tammy died from asphyxiation, and he pointed to specific physical evidence like pink foam in her mouth and bruising on her neck and biceps.
Which directly contradicts the defense's claims that she died from natural causes. They were trying to say it was things like anemia, herbal medicines, maybe even essential oils. But Dr. Christensen's findings don't support that at all.
And you have to remember, Dr. Christensen is a renowned expert. His testimony carries a lot of weight. So when he says it wasn't natural causes, people are going to listen. And for the jury, that's a pretty big deal. It makes you think about all those other explanations Chad might have offered up that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny.
It does make you wonder, okay, so we've got the digital trail, the conflicting stories, and now this bombshell medical evidence. But wait, there's more.
Yeah.
We also have this unexpected appearance of Chad's brother, Matt, sitting with the victims' families in the courtroom.
Talk about a family divided. The fact that Chad's own brother chose to sit with the families of the victims, I mean, that speaks volumes.
Right. And you can't forget That moment when Chad actually winked to his brother.
Yeah.
And Matt just stared straight ahead,
Oh,
didn't
no.
even react. It makes you think about the immense pressure and scrutiny these families must be under.
It's a powerful visual reminder of the real human cost of this case. These aren't just names in a headline. These are real people whose lives have been completely shattered by these events. And then, of course, we have the testimony of Alice Gilbert, Chad's next-door neighbor. She had a front-row seat to the changing dynamic between Chad and Tammy.
Alice's testimony is so interesting because she actually noticed a shift in their relationship back in 2019. She said they seemed more distant. And she even testified that Tammy never seemed to have any health issues, which kind of pokes holes in Chad's claims that she died from natural causes, right?
Yeah, it does raise some questions. If Tammy was seemingly healthy, why was Chad so quick to accept her death as just some random medical event? It doesn't quite add up.
Not really. And then Alice dropped this really chilling anecdote about how Chad asked her to keep Tammy's death quiet. He even told her about his new girlfriend just weeks after Tammy passed away.
The lack of grief is definitely noticeable, isn't it? It's as if he was already moving on, almost as if Tammy's death was just a minor inconvenience on the path to this new life he was creating.
And the way Alice described it, he wasn't exactly mourning. He was almost nonchalant about it.
It's chilling, isn't it? Especially when you consider the fact that at that point, nobody even knew what had happened to the children.
Right. It makes you wonder what was going through Chad's mind during those weeks. Was he genuinely grieving? Or was he already preoccupied with this new life he was building with Lori?
Okay, so we've got this digital trail, conflicting stories, bombshell medical evidence, a family divided, and now this neighbor who witnessed Chad's odd behavior after Tammy's death. But it doesn't stop there. Her husband, Todd Gilbert, also had some pretty disturbing things to share about his conversations with Chad. This is where things take a really dark turn. Todd testified that Chad had told him about having visions. And one of those visions was that Tammy would die before she turned 50. And guess what? She did.
It's like something out of a movie, right? Sounds too creepy to be true.
It's definitely unsettling. And Todd also mentioned how Chad seemed detached and emotionless when he told him about Tammy's death. And then, just like Alice, Todd also testified about Chad casually mentioning his new girlfriend, Lori. It's like he was telling everyone except the people who were actually investigating Tammy's death.
Right. And the fact that he was so open about it seems really strange, almost calculated, like he wanted people to know he had moved on. And then, to make things even more unsettling, Todd shared that Chad believes Lori was the person he was meant to be with in this life, the person he needed to fulfill his mission.
This is where those end times beliefs start to come into play, and it raises all sorts of questions about whether Chad was using his beliefs as a way to justify his actions, even if those actions were harmful to others.
Right. So we've got a whole lot to unpack here. Digital evidence, conflicting stories, suspicious behavior, and these disturbing visions. And we haven't even gotten to Kay Woodcock's testimony yet. She's J.J. Vallow's grandmother, and her account of the events leading up to J.J.'s disappearance is just heartbreaking.
Kay's story really personalizes this whole thing, you know? It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract legal proceedings. These are real people whose lives have been turned upside down.
Exactly. And her testimony highlights how manipulative Chad and Lori were, especially in their dealings with the children.
It's a good place to pause for now. In Part 2, we'll delve deeper into Kay's testimony and explore how the testimonies of Chad's own family members, Sheila and Heather Daybell, really blew the lid off this case. So we're back, diving deeper into the Chad Daybell trial. We left off talking about the digital trail, the conflicting stories, and just, well, the really odd behavior Chad exhibited after Tammy's death.
Right. And in Part 1, we started touching on Kay Woodcock's testimony, but honestly, we need to spend some more time with her story because it's just so powerful. Remember, she's J.J. Vallow's grandmother, and she was really the one who sounded the alarm when she suspected that something was wrong.
Kay's tenacity is just incredible. She refused to give up on JJ, even when Lori was being incredibly evasive, you know? Imagine being in her shoes. Your grandson's missing, and his own mother won't tell you where he is. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes those Amazon purchases we talked about earlier seem even more incriminating, you know what I mean? Remember, shortly after Tammy died, someone was using Charles Vallow's credit card to buy things like wedding rings, a beach wedding dress, even a swimsuit.
Oh, yeah. It's almost like they were already planning their honeymoon, you know, while their spouses were still, well, alive.
It's pretty brazen when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you think about Kay's frantic attempts to get in touch with JJ. She was calling and texting Lori constantly, but Lori would barely respond. And when she did, she was vague and dismissive.
It paints a really stark contrast, doesn't it? On one side, you have Kay desperately trying to find her grandson, and on the other, you have Chad and Lori, seemingly unconcerned and already moving on with their lives.
And Kay's intuition was spot on. She knew something wasn't right, so she went to the police. And it's really thanks to her that this whole case started to unravel.
It's amazing how one person's determination can make such a difference.
Huh.
Okay, so we've talked about the digital evidence, the suspicious behavior, and now Kay's story. But the real bombshells, they came from Chad's own family members. His mother, Sheila, and his sister-in-law, Heather.
I mean, imagine being in that courtroom and seeing Chad's own mother take the stand. It must have been incredibly tense.
Oh, absolutely. And Sheila's testimony introduces this really interesting wrinkle in the story. Remember how Alice Gilbert testified that Chad told her Lori had a deceased daughter? Well, Sheila remembers things a little differently. She claims it was Lori who told her about the deceased daughter.
So who's telling the truth? It's a classic he said, she said situation. But it really makes you question the reliability of both Chad and Lori's accounts, doesn't it?
Right.
Are they intentionally misleading people? Or are they just really bad at remembering details?
Right. It makes you wonder what else they might be misrepresenting. And then you have Heather's testimony, which was just explosive. She didn't hold back at all when talking about her concerns about Chad's, end times beliefs.
Heather testified that Chad had even predicted that their land would become this gathering place for survivors during the apocalypse. It's like something straight out of a doomsday movie.
It's really fascinating how these beliefs played such a central role in the events that unfolded. And what's interesting is that Heather, someone who knew Chad incredibly well, she didn't buy into his visions. She could see how these beliefs were changing him, and not in a good way.
Right, and she was clearly worried about the influence he was having on Lori, too. Remember, Heather was the one who called Chad after learning about his remarriage and actually confronted him about what happened to the children.
And Chad's response was incredibly telling, wasn't it? He got defensive and angry, even calling Heather a problem. It's almost like he felt threatened by her questions.
Yeah, and he tried to deflect by saying that she didn't need to worry about his children anymore because he was moving to Hawaii. What kind of response is that? It's like he was completely dismissing her concerns.
It definitely suggests that he was trying to control the narrative and shut down any kind of scrutiny. And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of Tammy's death, which, according to the medical examiner, was not from natural causes.
Exactly. And Chad even tried to give Heather this different explanation for Tammy's death, saying it was a pulmonary embolism, due to weight gain, which, of course, contradicts Dr. Christensen's findings.
So many conflicting stories. It just makes you wonder what else Chad might be hiding, right? And throughout all these testimonies, Chad's demeanor was really interesting to observe.
Yeah, according to reports, he was constantly fidgeting, staring intensely at Heather. And at one point, he was even, pretending to do work on his laptop. It's almost like he was trying to project this image of composure while internally freaking out.
You have to wonder what was going through his mind as all this evidence was being presented.
Yeah, it had to be unsettling, even for someone as seemingly detached as Chad. He was being confronted with his own words, his own actions, and the testimonies of people who knew him best. You could see that it was starting to chip away at his facade.
Absolutely. It's like the walls were closing in. And this was all before the trial even got to the really disturbing stuff.
You mean the testimony about those disturbing teachings? Yeah, we're getting to that next. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're picking up right where we left off with those disturbing teachings. If you thought the first two parts were intense, well, buckle up. Things are about to get even more unsettling.
You got that right. We've talked about the digital evidence, those conflicting stories, and the testimonies of people who were closest to Chad, including his own family members. But now we have to dive into the really chilling stuff. Chad's beliefs.
Exactly, because it's not just about what Chad did,
Yeah.
right? It's also about why he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where those end times teachings and his obsession with Lori Vallow really come into play.
I keep thinking back to Todd Gilbert's testimony about Chad's vision that Tammy would die before she turned 50. Chilling how that prediction actually came true.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if those visions were just like a way for Chad to mentally prepare for Tammy's death.
Yeah.
Maybe even to justify it to himself and others. Like he had this preordained plan, and anyone who got in his way was, well, expendable.
That's a disturbing thought, but it's hard to ignore when you consider how quickly Chad moved on after Tammy's death. He was already talking about moving to Rexburg with Lori, like he was just waiting for Tammy to be out of the picture.
Yeah. And remember, this was all happening before anyone even knew what had happened to the children. It's like he was so focused on his own desires, his own mission with Lori, that he completely disregarded everyone else.
It's almost as if he was operating in this alternate reality, a reality where his beliefs justified any action, no matter how harmful. And that's where Heather Daybell's testimony becomes so powerful. She really saw through his facade. She recognized that his visions were becoming increasingly dangerous, and she wasn't afraid to call him out on it.
Right, and you could tell that Chad was really threatened by her, too. Remember how he lashed out during that phone call? Called her a problem, told her to mind her own business.
Classic tactic used by people trying to maintain control. They try to silence anyone who questions their authority or their beliefs. And it's especially effective when you're dealing with someone like Chad, who is seen as a spiritual leader by many people.
Right, he had this whole persona built around his teachings, and anyone who dared to challenge those teachings was seen as an enemy.
It's a dangerous dynamic for sure. And it's one we see play out again and again in these cases involving cults or extremist groups. But in the end, the truth always has a way of coming out.
And it did in this case, too. Thanks to the meticulous work of law enforcement, the courage of those who testified, and of course that digital trail left behind by Chad and his associates, the truth is finally being revealed.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that even in today's digital age, it's pretty hard to hide your actions, something we should all keep in mind, right?
Definitely. So where do we go from here? Well, the trial's still ongoing. There are bound to be more twists and turns. But no matter what the final verdict is, this case raises some big questions that we all need to think about.
Questions about the nature of belief, the dangers of blind faith, and the responsibility we all have to hold those in positions of power accountable for their actions.
Is heavy stuff. And we know this case has been a tough one to follow. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and maybe even encouraged you to keep seeking the truth, even when it's hard.
And remember, this is just one case, one story. There are countless others out there just waiting to be explored. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.
Until next time.